Hello, hello. Am I in the right spot?
You were in the right spot, Alan. How are you, sir?
I figured from the hat. It's a nice hat.
You know what? I gotta represent, man. What can I say? I have a second one here too, so I've got two. I'm switching
Oh,
between. How
nice.
about that, huh?
I
Nice.
like it. I have a selection of hats upstairs as well too.
Oh, well, I figured. We figured you might. So Keith and I were like,
Yeah,
"Get have a hat on.
I,
Look,
I I wear the headphones on here, so it's hard to do the hat at the same time. But
that's the earbuds. So that's why I'm doing earbuds today.
right,
So
right.
okay, how best would you like to handle this one, sir? You want people to come in and actually
Yeah,
physically?
I'm hoping that people will come in with questions, and it just kind of organically goes from there. We'll see. I can always talk. I'm a pretty good talker.
Oh, you're fantastic. No, I appreciate you
But
saying
if you've got anything to ask, that you want to ask to get us started, or if we've got questions out of the gate, I'm happy to do that.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we've got some people already in the room, looks like, and I'm sure people are still coming in.
Sure.
My last session ended pretty right on time, and so, but I don't know if everybody did. So we'll
Right.
get a few till we officially start.
I know the panel we were on ended pretty promptly, so that group, I think, is at least free.
Good.
We'll
Yeah.
see. There's a
Awesome.
lot of great authors and great panels, so I won't be offended if we don't have a ton of people because I know there's a lot of great stuff going on.
No, it's fantastic. And your keynote was great. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
I
Thanks.
missed the very first part. I'm currently at my school, and my adult aides did not quite show up on time, and so I was kind of playing that out front, also fielding back here, and
Right.
it's what it is. It's life, right? Awesome. And I got to tell you before we even start, I was super excited for this because our next book club book is actually your Ground
Oh,
Zero.
sweet.
So
Thank
it's
you.
pretty
That's
sweet.
awesome.
We're stoked. We've got a number of kids that have already finished it for the month, and like they're already loving it to death. And I'm like, yeah, this is fantastic. So
Very cool. Very cool. I
yeah,
need to. What I've done in the past with some of my more recent books is I've filmed a YouTube video where I go on and I answer either burning questions or I talk about my inspiration process the way I did this morning in the keynote. And so I need to do one for Ground Zero. It just came out, so I haven't had a chance to do it yet. But there was a talk that I gave, a more in-depth talk about Ground Zero that I gave during the initial tour for that book. And I may just record myself doing that and then
awesome.
post it on YouTube so people can share that with their kids who are reading Ground Zero.
That'd be fantastic. Yeah, I would definitely love that. I know my kids are loving it. I got to say though, I'm not thrilled to think that it's the 20-year anniversary. It hadn't even
I know.
hit my head. And I saw that
To me,
somewhere and I went, no.
right. To me, it feels like in some ways that it was yesterday, and in many ways like it was 1,000 years ago. I mean, so much has happened since then that it's like, wow, has it? How can it not be more than 20 years? And then at the same time, it's so raw for so many of us that it's like, how is it? How is it 20 years already? Um, it's just a weird thing.
Well, and I saw a tweet somewhere yesterday saying that if a book is set in the 80s, it is now considered historical fiction.
It's
And
true,
I went, wait a second. And the person went on to say, and even more than that, in the 80s, we're as far away from the 80s as the 80s were from World War II. And my
right?
mind went, what? Time
Yeah,
passes so fast.
yeah,
I
yeah.
remember
It's
growing up.
wild.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, my wife and I were talking last night about something, and I said, I think it happened this century, and she kind of laughed, and she's like, wait, we are 21 years into a new century, and it's like, yeah, we're an appreciable number of years into a 100-year stretch.
Oh yeah, it's just maddening. And I remember my parents would say like they remembered exactly where they were when Kennedy was assassinated, and I'm like,
Right,
that's like forever ago. No,
right,
no, we're now past that time with 9/11, and it's just.
yeah,
I mean, I remember as a school teacher, the first year I had kids in my fourth grade class that weren't alive for it,
right.
and I went, oh, because I used to always on that day I would play the Yellow Card song. They've got a great song about that. I'll see if I can find the name of it, and we'd play through it a couple of times, and I'd take a lot of time because it was important. I think it's important history, and so the first year I realized you guys weren't even born yet. That blew my mind, and now I'm thinking back. It's been 20 full years, and
I was
that's
teaching
scary.
English. I was teaching English in 2001, as you heard in the keynote, I think. And I remember at one point being in my classroom, this has nothing to do with 9/11, but I was like, what did we do before the internet? Because somebody had looked something up, and one of the kids was like, we don't know. We weren't born, we were born after the internet started. And I was like, get out,
Yes.
just kind of like, I don't need to hear how old I am.
Well,
But it's so weird. My parents often talked about how fast the world changed and the kind of technology. They watched the moon landing, before I was born, and the way that the world changed so quickly while they were alive. And in many ways, we're seeing the same thing. It may not be as stark a change as no television to black and white television to color television to the internet. I mean, that's, but we're still seeing a real exponentially radical change in technology and the world. I remember being a kid in the 80s and everything was the United States versus the Soviet Union, and then the Soviet Union's gone. I mean, it's different, and we've got Russia, in a different way to deal with. But like, you think, oh my gosh, the Cold War is just going to be this is going to be the way it is forever, and then the Cold War ends and we move on. And it's just a really strange thing to look back at parts of your own life that are now historical fiction.
Yeah, that just blew my mind. I thought, what? No, stop it, shut the door. And it's like, no, that's what it is.
Yeah.
So the song I was thinking was called "Believe" by Yellowcard. I couldn't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but they actually took in the middle of the song, they actually popped in some audio snippets from different speeches that were given, like President Bush gave right after that and whatnot. And so it's just powerful. I mean, honestly, I'm excited. I'll be honest, I've not delved into your book yet, but I've read all the rest. But I'm stoked to be reading it next week is our spring break. And so that's top of my list for next week. And I'm like, okay, here we go. Because it's such a big one.
Cool.
But okay, well, we are officially at the 10 o'clock hour. So I would like to officially welcome everybody to the Alan Gratz question and answer session. Now, those of you that were in the keynote opening this morning, you got a nice sneak peek, and we got to learn a little bit more about Alan. And in my opinion, what makes him such a great author is because he spent time in the classroom. And so that I think you get kids in a way that some authors just don't, because you actually worked with them day in and day out. I'm not saying that's a requirement for authors, but everything I've touched of yours has been gold in my opinion, and many others feel the same way. So I think I'm going to put part of that on that aspect. So thank you very much for what you have done in the classroom, but what you're doing continually to help get kids excited to read. So we're going to go and start this off. If any of you have questions and you'd like to unmute your screen, in fact, anybody turn your screens on. Let's see some faces. We're happy for that. If you don't want to turn it on, don't feel inclined to do so, but we'd love to see some faces more than my ugly mug. I mean, the hat's helping, but it's not doing everything.
The hat's a good distraction. I found that. I'm not wearing the hat today because I got the headphones on, but usually the hat's a good way to distract from my looks as well.
Perfect. So if you guys have any questions and you don't want to speak them, I get it. Put it in the chat. I will do my best impersonation of you. I'll do, and if I say your name wrong, I apologize. Really, I try really, really hard. But if you want to just unmute and actually say it, let's have some questions. This is kind of your time. Let's get those burning questions out for Alan, because honestly, this is going to be an awesome event. I'm excited for.
So I'd love to talk about any of the books that I've written that I wasn't able to talk about more in detail this morning in the keynote, or even if you weren't there and want to get into one of those again, there's more I can say about each of those books, obviously. And then writing in general, my process and how you might be able to translate into that into the classroom, that kind of thing. I'm happy to talk about anything like that at all. So if anybody has a burning question, jump in there. Otherwise, Derek and I can.
We'll keep shooting the breeze, man. I got lots of stuff I can ask. We can do it.
Do you want to have them like raise their hand? Do you guys know the little hand? Do you have that little hand raiser thing at the bottom?
I think that's turned on. I'm trying.
Yeah, under reactions.
Yeah, it should be under there. Yeah.
Crystal says. Crystal asks in the chat. Love to hear about your writing process. I can jump into that while people are thinking or posting something or getting ready. So my writing process. So a lot of the books I do are historical fiction, not all, but most of them lately. And so the very first thing I do is I start with an idea. Like, let's take Ground Zero, for example. I knew that this year, as Derek and I were talking about before we officially got started, was going to be the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. And kids have been asking me to write a book about it for a long time. And I'd kind of put it off because it was still very emotional and raw for me to think about and to write about. I wasn't in New York City when it happened. I was in Tennessee, but I was an American and I watched it happen the way that everybody else did. And I was really shocked by it and hurt by it. And I had really avoided writing about 9/11. In fact, I had tried once before. I wrote a book called The Brooklyn Nine that came out, I think, in 2009. And The Brooklyn Nine is about 9 generations of one American family and their connections to baseball and American history over the decades. And the kid in one story becomes the parent in the next and the grandparent in the next. So we see the connections between the family. And the last story in that was going to be set in 2009 when the book came out. And my idea was that I would, or actually rather, I was going to set the story in 2001. The book was going to come out in 2009, almost, I guess, about 8 years after the fact. But I actually wrote my first draft of that story with a kid in Manhattan, not in the tower, but watching it come down and trying to escape and help other New Yorkers and that sort of thing. And I wrote it and I turned it in, and my editor, who was in New York for 9/11, because a lot of the publishing houses are there, it wasn't quite right for her. And I kept trying to rework it, and neither of us could get it to where we really thought it should be. And finally, I totally took that story out and rewrote it as a kid who had survived a house fire, and had been injured and was struggling to get back into life. And basically, it was a metaphor for the way that I and many Americans had felt post 9/11. And but I didn't use 9/11 itself because it was so hard to write about. Okay, so finally, I decided this year I'll try it. I've got to be far enough removed from it. So I start diving into my research. So I'll get back to the process question here. Sorry, like I said, I can talk forever. So I knew I wanted to write this book about 9/11, but I also wanted to write it about what's happened since then. So, but I started with 9/11. So I go to the library. If you were at our historical fiction panel before this, you heard us talking about this. That's where all of my research begins. I go to the library, I check out a ton of books about the time and place that I want to write about. I bring them back here to my office. I sit down, and for 2 or 3 months, all I do is read books and take notes. Now, at this point, I may have a vague idea of what my story is going to be and a vague idea of who my character might be, but I often don't have a very strong idea. I'm looking for the story to come out of the research. I may think, oh, I want to have a kid in one of the towers who has to survive. So that helps me focus my reading not on what it was like to be outside the towers on the ground that day, but instead inside the towers. But I still want to do all that research to get an idea of what it was like inside and out. And while I'm doing my research, I have another file open on my computer which I just label like ideas for scenes for this 9/11 book. At this point, I don't even have a title for the book. And so I might be reading along and realize there are a lot of stories about people trapped in elevators who were trapped in elevators and struggled to get out and survived. And there have to be a number of people who were trapped in elevators who didn't survive. But of course, we don't know their stories because they weren't around to tell it. But I do have the stories of a bunch of different people who survived elevators. I'm like, okay, that could be a scene in this book. So I write up the notes about what happened to the real people in one document. Then I go over to the other document that's my idea for scenes. And I say, maybe my kid is trapped in an elevator and has to get out. I read about... like in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a country that has been at war for decades in different wars. Before the United States invaded in 2001, there was a bloody civil war, which is how the Taliban ended up coming to power. Before that civil war, the Soviet Union invaded, and they had a long and protracted war in Afghanistan in the 80s. And into it basically was part of, many people think is part of the reason the Soviet Union eventually collapsed because of, well, I won't get into all that. Again, that's research I've done that gets too deep. But Afghanistan's a country that's been at war for a long time. And I read an anecdote from somebody in one of these books that said that they had been in Afghanistan recently in the last 5 or 10 years, and they watched kids playing on old abandoned Soviet tanks. That there are still Soviet tanks that are bombed out and don't work and don't have any ammunition, that are half buried in the sand, and the kids use them as playground equipment because that's what they have to climb on and play on. And I was like, wow, what better way to show the history of conflict in this place than to have kids who are playing on the relics of a war that happened before they were born. In fact, that happened like during their grandparents or their parents' childhood and their grandparents' adulthood. So I find scenes like this. I find mentions of things, and I put that in my notes. Like, it'd be incredible to have either my kid playing on a tank or watching kids play on a tank. So I researched for 2 or 3 months, and while I'm doing this, I'm collecting these scenes. And once I feel like I have enough scenes to possibly make into a book, I stop doing research and I start outlining my book. The board back here behind me in my office is my big outline board. All those little note cards that are up there right now are chapters that I am working on right now for my new book, which is about climate change. So I'm reading books about different aspects of climate change. I'm trying to write a fire story, a flood story, a famine story, and a polar ice cap melting story. And so I've got rows of cards that'll be each part of that story up on the board. And I outline my books chapter by chapter before I ever write the first word. And the way I get these chapter ideas is I go back to that list of scene ideas that I typed up during my research. And I start saying, okay, well, I think I want to have a place where they play on tanks. Is that a whole chapter? Probably not. So I'll combine it with something else. Getting out of an elevator, that might be multiple chapters. So that might be a whole section of this outline. So I start looking at the things that I've pulled out of my research and think to myself, is this a full scene? Is it something I just mentioned in passing? Is it a longer sequence? And I start building it up there in my outline. The outline process often takes me about a month to put together. And at this point, I'm not writing any part of the story. I'm just building the story up on here. And I love to do this by hand. I write on note cards with a pencil and do it by hand because I have to type my stories later on because I need to be fast and I need to be writing the words as soon as I think them in my head. But when I'm outlining, the most important thing is actually to spend more time with the story, to stretch that out, to give my brain time to work all the different angles. And so I love doing that by hand. I also love to write by hand, period. And I wish I could write my books by hand, but there's just no time for that. But I love writing by hand in this way because it slows me down and I can think about things. And I take cards down and throw them away and rewrite them and put them back up on the board or change things as I need to. And sometimes then I have to go back and do another round of research at the end of this to fill in some blanks or to find out more about something that I didn't dive into in my first round of research. But then, so after about 3 or 4 months of researching and outlining, then I'm finally ready to dive into writing the book. And I can usually write an entire first draft of a book, about 275, 300 pages in 1 month, because I have done all this work to prepare myself to be creative ahead of time. So I couldn't sit down and write a book in a month if I hadn't done any of that work, because then I'd be researching and outlining and figuring out my story and all that stuff on the fly. Instead, I do all that stuff ahead of time. Then when I sit down, I can knock out a first draft. Once I'm done with that first draft, I wish I was done with the book, because that's my favorite part, is writing that first draft. But unfortunately, just like you tell your kids, revision is the most important part of my writing process. I turn the book into my editor. She reads it and she writes me back an editorial letter. And these editorial letters are often 10 to 20 pages long. And they go through the whole book and they tell me everything that's working and everything that's not working, mostly the stuff that's not working. And my editor will say, like, this part, I don't understand this character's motivation, or why did you make this choice? Or can we see more of this? And I go back through that and I start to write a second draft based on her notes. I don't have to make every change that she asks for, but she has worked on way more books than I have because she's worked with many authors. I trust her. She's got a great eye for pace. She knows what I'm trying to do with the book because we've talked about the general, like the gist of it, what I want it to say and mean. And so she helps me focus on that goal, because it's really easy to get lost in the cornfield, as a friend of mine likes to refer to this process. I love this image. If you've ever been to one of those cornfield mazes or in the fall where they knock down parts of it and make a maze out of it, you can get in there and get lost in the corn maze. But then oftentimes in the middle of the corn maze, there's a place you can climb up, like a raised platform. And you get up there and you can see the layout of the whole thing. You're in the middle of the maze and you can finally see it. And what you need as a writer is somebody to stand on that podium in the middle and say, turn left, like somebody who's telling you how to get out of that corn maze. Because I've by this point, I've spent, gosh, 5-6 months probably like immersed in my world of the book. And I now don't see the problems or the holes in it, because in my head they're filled in. And so I need those outside eyes, that outside reader to help me out and guide me. So I don't have to do everything my editor says, but it really helps. And I do listen to everything she says. If she brings something up and she says, I don't know why you did X. And I'm like, well, I don't know why I did it either. I was just kind of writing and I put that in there. Sometimes I just take that out. Sometimes she'll say, I don't know why you did X. And I'll say, oh, wait, I had a real good reason for this. I'm trying to show how, like, why did you put in this scene with the kids playing on the tanks, for example? And I would say, oh, I'm trying to show how war has been a part of these people's lives. She'll be like, great, then expand on that. Like, let's play with that theme a little bit more. So sometimes it's not me taking things out, but just kind of reinforcing what's already there. Okay, so we go back and forth for, I guess, oftentimes 7 or 8 different drafts. At the beginning, I might be rewriting the whole thing over and over, like the whole thing from scratch. I mean, I've got the original there and I'm working from the original, but I might just start a whole new file and start typing in a whole new book. For Allies, my first draft had 20, I think it had 26 characters that we followed in different ways through the story. And I turned it in and my editor came back and she's like, I think we need fewer focus characters. And I was like, oh, but I love all these characters. I'm like, okay, how many do you think I should cut? And she's like, I think we need like 6. And I was like, you want me to cut 6? That's cool. She's like, no, I think it should be 6 characters. And I was like, no, I just did all this work on like 20 plus characters. But she was right. She was right, because when we talked about it, she was like, it's too many. We never get to know any of them well enough. We don't spend any time with them. Like you show many different facets of D-Day, but it becomes more about the event and less about the people there. And she was totally right. And so I had to go in and cut like 20 characters from the first draft of Allies. I don't know what I was thinking. It was foolish to begin with, but it's if you were at the historical fiction panel, it's a little bit of what Jennifer Nielsen was talking about. When you find something interesting about history, you want to keep following it and you want to tell that story. You want to put everything in the book, and you quickly learn you can't. So not only did I have to cut like 20 characters from Allies, the main character in Allies, in my first draft, I had one character who was the main character all the way through, and the other ones were around him and his story. I cut that character out too. And I took one of the other 26 characters whose story I liked more and made him the main character. And now, like from the first draft to the second draft, I took out 20 characters, and I also changed the entire focus character, the main character, to somebody else. That's not work I like doing. That's not I like to figure those big problems out before I write the first draft of the book. But I'm super proud of Allies and how it came out. It's actually been my most well-reviewed. I think it got more starred reviews than all of my other than any of my other books. And so like the process was painful, but the final result was what I wanted. And so my editor and I go back and forth, big changes, getting smaller and smaller and smaller until like the 7th or 8th draft. We're just working on one chapter that I have to get right, a big finale, or oftentimes the intro. The first 2 or 3 chapters, I'm often rewriting every single time, trying to get those right. There's so much work to do in the first chapters, introducing characters, introducing the world. Look, whenever I write a book about World War II for middle schoolers, every single time, I have to explain who Adolf Hitler is every single time. And it seems ridiculous. Like, I'm like, why am I telling again who Adolf Hitler is? Why? Because this might be a 5th grader picking up this book, and it might be his or her first time they've ever read about Adolf Hitler. They may have heard the name, but really don't understand who that is. And my book might be the first time that they ever really understand. And so I have to do it every single time. And so there's a whole bunch of work to do in the first 2 or 3 chapters without making it feel like an info dump. And so I rewrite those chapters over and over again. Finally, when all that is done, and my editor and I are like, okay, that's as good as we think it's ever going to get. and the time is coming to publish it, then they will take it away and somebody makes a cover for it. I have like zero to do with my covers. Now they'll show it to me and say, what do you think? Or actually, they don't even say, what do you think? It shows up in my inbox and they're like, here it is. And they don't even, there's no question attached to that. It's like, here's your cover, because they don't want me to come back and say, it stinks, because even if I don't like it, they're not going to change it. There have been a couple of times where I've been able to say, like, on the cover of Project 1065, it looked like it does now. And there's this kid running away from planes and people searching for him through a field. And he's a member of the Hitler Youth. He's a spy in the Hitler Youth, but he's a member of the Hitler Youth. And I was like, hey, I know we don't want to put like a swastika on the cover. I'm cool with that. But can we put like a red armband on his arm as he's turned, so we get the idea that maybe he's in the Hitler Youth and gets at that spy angle? And they're like, oh, that's cool. And there's that tiny little pop of red in addition to the lettering on the cover of the book. So I was able to make some suggestions there. But even my idea for Ground Zero, so I had this idea for the cover of this book where it would be a kid watching out of the North Tower, a hole in the North Tower where the wall has been stripped away, watching a helicopter hovering in front of him, because I thought that was just an incredible image to be up as high as a helicopter and have it like staring back at you. And that's a scene in the book, in fact. And I thought, like, there's wires sparking and the building is broken around him. They ended up not going with that because we ended up with the title of Ground Zero. Sort of later in the game, they wanted it to focus on the ground itself, the location, the set, the place where the towers came down. I still think it's a really powerful cover, and that wreckage is as iconic as seeing the buildings burning, unfortunately. But anyway, the cover gets made, and then it's still not ready to come out. Then they take it, the sales reps take it out to bookstores and try to tell them about it and see if they'll carry it. They let you guys in libraries know about it, see if you want to put it on your shelves. It gets reviewed by reviewers. And then, like a year after I was actually done writing it, the book actually comes out. And so it's a very strange thing. Ground Zero just came out in February, and I have to go back and talk about a book that I finished writing over a year ago. And I've been working on a new book ever since. And it's like, oh, wait, I have to stop thinking about the book I'm writing now and go back and talk about this book that I spent like 2 years writing. And so I have all this information in my head about it. But wait, I have to change gears now from what I'm doing. It's very strange. Nothing happens fast in publishing, especially with historical fiction, because it takes a long time to put it together. But that's a very long answer to a short question, but that's kind of the overall process of how I go from idea to when the book appears on your library shelves.
That was a fabulous answer. Honestly, I was enthralled, but the nerd in me has to ask a couple of follow-ups really quickly. You said use index cards and pencils.
Yep.
Always pencils or pens? I mean, I'm an analog guy. I listen to a podcast called the Pen Addict Podcast. So yep. This is my nerd level. So what are you using tool-wise on that?
I love writing with pen just in general. And for that, I'm actually a fan of these very old-fashioned Bic crystal pens that are just like the cheapo things, but I love the way they write. They write with a really thick line. I'm a kind of a pen geek like you, and that's what I like to sign with those and Sharpies. But when I'm doing the cards, I really like to do it with pencil. Here's one like I'm working on right now for the climate change book. And I take these larger note cards and I cut them in half. I used to use the whole note card and put it up there. But what I found was I can fill a whole note card with stuff that happens in a chapter. The problem is it's too much in a chapter. And so what I realized was, well, if I give myself less space and try and get it all on the front of that card, then I will automatically limit how much action I'm putting in a chapter. And that helps me cut it down from what could be a monster chapter to a regular size chapter. But I love writing with pencil too, because again, while I'm doing this part, I'm changing my mind. I'm thinking, wait, no, I don't want to do this or that. And I use the eraser and I'll erase parts of it and rewrite it. Sometimes when I've done a whole card, it's not worth erasing and I'll just chuck the little half card. I mean, these are like $1 for a packet. So I can throw it in the recycle bin, but I'm also erasing things and rewriting them on there. And my favorite pencils by far are the old Ticonderoga Blacks. These are great pencils. So I'm really particular about that too. But I've got a pencil sharpener and I just sit there and as it dulls down, just sharpen it back up. And that's kind of the soundtrack to my outlining, is me sharpening pencils all day long in my office.
Awesome. Well, thank you for humoring me on that little bit there.
Sure.
There are some other great questions in here I want to make sure we get to.
Yeah, let's go for it.
So let's see, about the one was, what's your next project?
Sure. So I'm working on this book about climate change, and I've been asked by a lot of teachers and kids also to write something about climate change. Writing about climate change is difficult because it's not a single event like D-Day, for example, or 9/11. And so it's very broad. It's a huge, huge topic. There are many ways that the climate is changing and that it's affecting our lives. How do I show that? Climate change is a thing that happens over time and slowly to the earth. But what I'm focusing on is the immediate results, like wildfires in California, or flooding from hurricanes in the Gulf states. And I'm trying to take those events and tell stories of how those kind of events are exacerbated or more frequent because of climate change. I'm playing with an idea in the first draft of it. Again, I'm outlining, so I haven't even written the first draft, but I'm playing with the idea of 2 degrees. The Earth has warmed up 2 degrees since the beginning of the industrial age, and that's brought real measurable changes. And another 2-degree change could radically change the Earth, according to scientists. And so I'm playing with the idea of 2 degrees of climate change, but also 2 degrees of separation. It was discovered in the 2000s because of social media, especially. But we always talk about 6 degrees of separation, and how we're this idea that we're connected to anybody else in the world through 6 degrees of connections between other people. They think now that number might be as low as 2. They think that we might be connected to every other person in the world by 2 other people between us. And I want to play with the idea that we're all connected and that we're all sharing this planet and responsible for it, with the 2 degrees of separation and also the 2 degrees of climate change. Somebody says that they have a daughter living in Asheville right now. I bet we're 2 degrees separated ourselves, for sure. So that's very cool. I bet we've sat in the same restaurants and eaten. We're back when we could eat in restaurants, but hopefully we'll get back to that soon. But that's what I'm working on right now. I'm also working on a graphic novel version of Refugee. And I'm very, very, very excited about this. I'm a huge comics fan and graphic novel reader myself. I love them. I think they're an incredible way for dormant readers, to get back to Donna Lynn Miller's description of reluctant readers, for dormant readers to become readers. The whole reason that picture books work when you're younger is because you can see the pictures and associate the words with the images. And comic books are the same thing. Graphic novels are the same thing. And so I think they're a great way for kids who are daunted by novels to jump into a story. So we're turning Refugee into a graphic novel. I've written the first draft of that script. It's with my editor, and they're looking at artists, which I'm super excited about. So that's where I am right now. And I've got lots more things on the horizon, but those are the 2 most immediate ones.
Awesome. I'm excited for that Refugee graphic novel. I'm huge. That was one of my first books I've read of yours.
Cool. Thank you.
Fell in love with it. So that'll be very, very exciting. And so like you said, you don't have an illustrator yet on that?
No, so no art to show off. I'm super excited to see that. They've sent me a couple of people that they were looking at, and they asked me if I had any suggestions as well. And being a comic and graphic novel fan, I had a few suggestions. The art department will still make their own decision, but it's really cool that they've included me in the process of at least evaluating, like me saying, like, I love this one, or this style is amazing. They're still going to go with whoever they think fits best for the project. But it's cool to be involved in that.
Awesome. Hey, it looks like Joy has her hand up. So
go for it.
Go ahead, Joy.
That's me. I just wanted to give you a little feedback to hear that you're going to do a graphic novel. I work in an elementary school, K-5. Those kids will be flying off the wall when they hear that news. We just had a book fair, and Ground Zero sold out. The kids have it on hold. We bought a couple copies for the library, but they're coming back looking for nonfiction to learn more about Ground Zero. And doing a graphic novel will help it be accessible for some of the kids who aren't going to pick up a big, thick book. But I've really seen during COVID that more kids are willing to pick up a thick book. Maybe they have a little bit less time doing extracurricular and more time to read. So there have been some good things. Yes, I didn't really have a question. Just wanted
No,
to
that's
give you
great.
feedback.
No, that's
how
very
happy
cool.
it is. So thanks for your work.
Totally, thank you. And the book fairs, the Scholastic book fairs, have been a great way for my books to get out there and for people to see me. They've been really amazing. And thank you guys for sharing my books with your young readers. I really appreciate that. And you know, I've thought about writing nonfiction. I know so many kids who are reluctant readers will read nonfiction where they won't read fiction, which is always strange to me because I always go to fiction first. It's funny, Don Tate in an earlier session was saying he never reads fiction. I almost entirely read fiction, although I mean, for fun. Lately, I have been working more nonfiction into my reading for fun. Maybe it's just me getting older and more mature and having being able to settle in for a little bit longer on nonfiction. Maybe it's also that nonfiction writers are doing so much more work to make their work creative nonfiction, to really make it a narrative nonfiction work, where, you know, a straight up account of you know, of everything that happened to D-Day. While I'm interested in that time and that day, I might not be as interested in it if it's really presented like a textbook. I want to hear the personal stories of the people, the way that Candy was talking about in the earlier session. So yeah, I've actually thought, so I've been working on the climate change book for a little while. And then when the Capitol was invaded in January, I immediately wrote to my editor and I said, let me write a book about the Capitol invasion. Like, let's put the climate change is not going away, unfortunately. Let's put it on hold for a year and let me do this right now. Let me jump on this and not only tell a story about the Capitol invasion, but sort of how we got here. Me go back a couple of decades and look at other events where white supremacy has been on the rise. And let me jump into this and write about it. We eventually decided to hold off because we really just don't know what the end of that story is yet. And we wanted to make sure that we know, like, there were things that this literally was like the couple of weeks after it happened. And we were still like, we don't even know what we're going to find out about what happened here. So maybe I shouldn't write this book yet, because there could be things discovered after it even comes out that we would want to put in the book. So it's not that they said, don't write this book. It's they said, maybe we should just wait until we know a little bit more about everything and the reasons behind it and the fallout from it. But I will sometimes see an event like that and just want to absolutely jump on it and write about that. Instead, so this is to get back to the nonfiction question. They said, instead of doing that, what if you wrote a nonfiction book about the rise of white supremacism in the United States? And I was like, oh my gosh. I mean, wow, I haven't written nonfiction before. I don't know if if that's the one I want to jump in on, but I mean, maybe I'm the person to write that. So I've got other novels that are in line to write, like deadlines to finish those. So I don't know when or if I could do that work on the nonfiction project, but it's something that's really intriguing to me. And as I said in the earlier panel, I'm really in awe of people who write nonfiction, because the immense amount of research they have to do. I still do a ton of research for my historical fiction, but then I put a fictional character in the middle of it. So I don't have to know, like Candy was saying, I don't have to know who their first kiss was and if they sleep on their back and what they eat for breakfast, that real person. I can make that stuff up. It's the history behind it that I get right, of course. Just like there's, but boy, having a character where you have to get everything right because it was a real person, that's tough. But I'm maybe because I know kids love nonfiction, and I'm learning to love it as a reader as well.
Excellent. Thanks, Joy. What a great question. Thank you so much. And thanks for raising your hand and asking your question. How fun to have your voice there as well. So there's another question here from Cami. So any indie books as an option for you, or is everything traditional publishing only?
Oh, right. So everything's been traditional publishing. So I started my career with Penguin before they were Penguin Random House. And I was published at an imprint called Dial through my first 5 books, I think. And then did one book with Simon & Schuster. It was a Star Trek novel. I'm a big Trekkie. So if anybody else is a Trek fan, I do have a Star Trek novel that I wrote. It's young adult. They were doing some young adult stuff about Kirk and Spock and Uhura and Bones and the whole crew before they go off on the Enterprise when they're at Starfleet Academy. So I got to write a Starfleet Academy book. That was a bucket list thing for me. Check that one off the list. And then after that, I sort of made the transition. And I've written a number of books with a Macmillan imprint called Starscape. I did a series called The League of Seven, which is steampunk fantasy novels, and also banned this book through Starscape. But most of my more popular books lately have been the Scholastic books, the black and white and red books like Ground Zero. And my first of those was Prisoner B3087. And I think I have now 7 books with Scholastic out, now counting Ground Zero. So all of them have been traditionally published. There was a time I thought about doing some indie stuff, like taking some of my characters and continuing those worlds when a publisher didn't want more books in a series or more books in a world. It's still something that I'm very interested in, but I have found success with traditional publishing, and I'm going to keep writing that for a little while. I've at this point just signed a 4-book deal with Scholastic that will take me through. Gosh, so the first book in that will be for 2022. So 23, 24, 2025. That's kind of just insane to think about. But I've got books planned out all the way through. Is that the Age of Aquarius? It seems like that's no, that was 25, not 2025. But I've got books coming out for a long time, planned at least. And so no plans to write anything on my own. Although I have thought about doing a podcast, which would be writing things, writing and publishing without a contract, without being paid by somebody else to do that. But no, I really respect indie publishers, indie writers, because they have to do everything themselves. They have to write it. They have to find an editor or edit themselves, and then they have to do a lot of promotion on their own. Luckily, with traditional publishing, I have a lot of partners for that that help me out. It still feels overwhelming sometimes to be writing and doing all the promotion stuff that you have to do. And I'm not even the only person working on it. So traditional publishing for me for the foreseeable future.
So a follow-up on that. So you mentioned you've had ideas of taking some of your characters from the traditionally published world and then taking them and moving them into more of an indie piece. How does that work legally? I mean, so I'm assuming you own the copyright to the characters and the stories, and they just merely own the copyright of the published book. How does that work? Right. Can you help us with that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it gets a little technical, but like for the League of Seven, I have all these characters that I invented for those books, and the copyright is in my name. And so I wouldn't be able to tell that story of one of the books in a different way without working with the publisher. But I could take the characters in those stories and I could write a whole other story and publish it if I wanted to. It's a way that we've seen a number of authors continue their series that got canceled, especially in the adult world, adult mysteries or adult fantasy novels, where they got 5 or 6 books in and then the publisher said, we don't want any more, but they knew that there was an appreciable audience who would make self-publishing those books worthwhile. So again, it's a situation where if you take the book to them, your new thing that you've written, and they say no, then it's yours to do with whatever you want to.
You just have to give them the first chance to refuse. Is that kind of how that works?
Oftentimes they'll have in a contract a first right of refusal, especially for characters or things set in that world. But even then, like when a book contract is done, so you got to have a writer in your contract that says, we want to first look at your next book. And oftentimes if it's not right for them, they'll just say, no, not for us, but go and sell it somewhere else. Godspeed. I mean, they're not being, most publishers aren't trying to shut you down. If it's not something they want, they're happy for you to take it elsewhere.
Excellent. Thanks so much. Hey, looks like we have a question from Patrice. She has her hand up. Patrice, if you want to unmute and your mic and her screen, how you want to handle that, go for it, Patrice.
Thank you. As a librarian, we are constantly fighting against censorship, and I love using your book, Ban This Book. And in light of what's happened this week, I wonder what your feelings are about balancing that line between political correctness and censorship. How do you feel about what's happened this week? And by the way, you are growing in popularity in my library. I read Refugee and I cannot keep your books on the shelves. So keep doing your phenomenal work.
Thank you. Tell me what you mean by
Students
this
are
week,
loving
though, and hopefully I've read about this. But what's happened this week that you were talking about?
Dr. Seuss Foundation
right.
has,
Okay.
yeah. Mhm.
Sure. I knew. Now I've read that. I've read that article. Sure. So, and the Dr. Seuss Foundation has been talking for a long time. Like I remember reading months ago that they had an image from one of his books, like painted on the wall of the Dr. Seuss Museum or something like that, and that they eventually decided they would paint over that image because it had caricatures of Chinese people in there that they were uncomfortable with. There's a chapter in the original. Oh, is it the original Mary Poppins that feels kind of racist and that sort of thing, and it's tricky because we want to celebrate the works of the past, but we also don't want to keep perpetuating stereotypes that go unremarked upon. And I'm all for having the original books around so we can see what we did and we can make sure we don't do that again. But I don't think that it's censorship, particularly when the Dr. Seuss family says we're going to withdraw these because we're uncomfortable with them. I can see an author saying, I wrote something 10 years ago that I'm not comfortable with anymore, and saying, I either want to change future editions of that, if the author or illustrator is around to do that, or I just don't want it published anymore. I think what is I have a quote over here. I'm gonna go grab it so I don't butcher it. But it's a Maya Angelou quote that I have up in front of my desk and I need to memorize it. But it's do the best you can until you know better. Yeah, and then when you know better, do better, right? So a lot of people have already heard this. I love that, and I'm always trying to do the best that I can. But I will undoubtedly make mistakes. And I would love the ability to go back and say, hey, I made a mistake. I want to change it for the future. So to me, I don't see it as censorship. I think that it is, it's critically evaluating books of the past and saying, I don't want to ban these books, but if they're on the shelf, maybe saying like, hey, this, like a thing at the beginning of it that says, this has depictions of people, we don't do this anymore, but this is the way this book was written, right? And in Grenade, the book I wrote about the Battle of Okinawa, my American soldiers walk around talking about Japanese people as Japs, because that's the way they would have spoken at the time. But we put at the beginning of the book, the characters use language in this book that was seen as okay at the time, but is no longer okay. And so I'm not trying to whitewash. That's the wrong word for it here, because that's a different thing that we're dealing with. I don't want to smooth over or cover up the things that people did in the past, but I also don't want to present it as this is still acceptable. So it's tricky.
Okay,
and
that's a good bridge.
Yeah. And again, I want all the books to be on the shelf. I wrote ban this book, and I really believe in the message of it, that nobody can tell you what books you can and can't read except your parents. But I also think that publishers and authors ought to be personally responsible or institutionally responsible for putting messages in their books and saying, this book was written at a time when such and such was acceptable. It's no longer acceptable. I don't think that we should change the language in Huck Finn. I think the language should be exactly as it was. But I think that then we need to talk about why that was acceptable and why it's not now.
Truly, it's the perspectives that you give in the book that open for discussion. And I love that. And the students, and I've even told adults, I said, from Refugee, I had no idea that Jews were shipped to Cuba. I had no idea that had happened. And they're shocked also. So very
good recommendation on that is Ruth Behar wrote a book that just came out last year called Letters from Cuba. And it's specifically about the Jews who moved to Cuba and made their lives there. Ruth Behar, Behar. And Letters from Cuba is a great follow-up to that if they're interested in that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, totally. And thanks for the question. It's tricky. And I think it's really important for us to hear from communities and sections of society. And if they say this is a representation of us that we don't like, we need to listen to that and do better.
You know, Alan, I love that question, and I love how you handled Grenade. That book,
Thanks.
I read that over the summer and absolutely fell in love with it. And I love that you handled that in the way you said, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to write it historically accurate, because I think that's
Right.
an important piece of historical fiction. We need to make sure that it's as accurate as possible. But then you said, but it's not going to be appropriate now. You know,
Right.
I'm including it because if I didn't, I wouldn't be honest with myself and with the past. And so
Right.
I appreciate you for having that respect and honor for the past, good, bad, or ugly. I think we live in a time where people are trying to make changes, and it's like, you know what? We all make mistakes, and if we can't learn from our mistakes, we're going to repeat them. But the other part of that is that if we don't know our history,
Right.
we're going to repeat history. And
And we can't pretend that we didn't make mistakes. Like
Yeah.
that's almost as harmful as making the mistake to begin with. You know, we have to own the fact that the United States was a slave economy, and that people were held as slaves in the United States, and we can't, like, just as an example, and we can't cover that up. We need to own it. We need to show it on the page, and then we need to talk about it, and we need to talk about the effect on Black Americans ever after. So like we've got to make sure. So, but your comments bring up another thing I want to touch on. At the same time, there are things I leave out. Obviously, I don't curse in my books because that is a bridge too far for many adults to put a book into a kid's hands. And so, look, while I have my Americans say things that were slurs against Japanese people in the book, they are not cursing. And you know those guys were cursing. You know they were cursing up a storm in the Battle of Okinawa and everywhere else in World War II. So there are things I leave out that are just not, like, it's just not necessary, and it's not as vital to show that, so that, because we don't need to talk about the fact that they were cursing or not. What we do need to talk about is the way we demonized and dehumanized other people as propaganda, as both sides did that. The Japanese did it about us. We did it about them. We did it about Germans. Germans did it about us. So those are important things that we have to talk about. Whereas, to leave those out would be to take an important part of the history out. The language is, the profanity is something that we still do today. So it's not, it may be seen as socially unacceptable, but it's not something that we're saying like, oh, we did this thing as a country before, we've got to absolutely stop it. We can't keep using this derogatory language about individual groups of people. So anyway, there are bridges I don't cross. I don't put profanity in my books, but that's because I feel like it's not the issue at the heart of the story.
Well, and I think it goes to show that how well you understand your audience. I mean, you're not writing adult suspense, that kind of stuff. I think if you were writing that, I would assume that you might be, maybe an assumption, you might be more willing to put some of that in there. But where you're writing for youth, I'm with you. I don't think it's necessary. It doesn't get the point across. You're hitting the things that really are necessary. And yeah, I think all of us know that, there was other language happening.
Right.
We don't need to worry about that.
I also pull back on the visceral descriptions. People might be hearing this and being like, "What? Your books are already really like graphic." But I even want to push it farther than that, and my editor is always working to help me find that appropriate balance for middle grade. So really, the two things I do, I don't put language in the books or sexual situations that are just beyond their age. But I also I try to pull back on the visceral or graphic description of violence. I want to put it in there. I want to put the violence in there because if I'm writing about war or the Holocaust or something, or refugees, I don't want to sugarcoat the experience of the people who went through those things. It's important not to, but at the same time, I don't have to go into a graphic description of the result of that. So that allows a reader who's more mature to fill in the blanks, and the less mature reader to understand what happened, but not be hopefully scarred by a mental image of something.
Exactly. And what a great example of working with your editor to find the nice sweet spot. And what a good example for us as librarians and educators to say, okay, students, here's what's happening. We're going to play that role as the editor as you're writing to help you find that sweet
Right.
spot of what should and maybe you may not want to think about and including. And so excellent. Thank you so much for your time, Alan. Honestly, I hate to say this, but our time, we're at 10:47. I would enjoy going for many, many more. I know your time is very valuable. We hate to keep pulling through your time, but thank you so much.
Thank you. And I know you guys have to have a break before your next session and that sort of thing. Thank you guys for being with me. And again, thank you for sharing my books with your young readers. Thank you.
And again, for those that are here, I want to remind you, if you want to come back and rewatch parts of this recording will be available on the Sketch site for a limited time. I don't know exactly when the dates and when things are getting pulled, but you'll be getting an email from UELMA board basically telling you, here's when these videos will be up for. And then there will be other sessions that will also be on YouTube. The author sessions, I believe, are all going to be just on Sketch for now. And I think that's where they're going to stay. But feel free to go back and rewatch. If you have any questions or anything else for Alan, I'm sure he would not have any problems with you reaching out on Twitter or an email. Check out his
email's
website.
on my website.
Yep, alangratz.com, and he's online on Twitter at Alan Gratz. Thank you again for your time, and thank you. We appreciate all you do for helping to get great books that are historically accurate for our kids to get that excitement going. So thank you, Alan.
Cool. Thanks, Derek, and thank you everybody for being here.
Okay, see you later.
Bye, guys. Have a great weekend.